Whenever I teach modernism, I am reminded of December of 1999 when the world celebrated the Millennium New Year. Now, for real, mathematically, the new millennium didn't start until 2001 because December of 2000 would have been the end of that millennium. But we don't do math really well, and everyone thought 1999, that's when the new millennium started. And there was real sense of pessimism at that time because of the Y2K bug. Computer systems at that time only had two digits for the year. And so it was believed that when the year turned to 2000, all the computer systems would think it was actually 1900. And so planes were going to fall out of the sky. The power was going to go out. The water systems wouldn't work anymore. We really gathered together and watched the news on December of 1999 to see what kind of havoc would happen. And nothing happened because, of course, people fixed the computer systems well ahead of time and just created two more digits in the year and everything was fine. But there's always this nervousness whenever you come to a new century, a new millennium, sometimes even to a new decade. And that's really what's happening with this period that we call modernism, when the calendar switches over from the 1800s to the 1900s. The painting you're looking at there on your screen, you probably know because it's one of the most famous paintings in American art, is American Gothic, painted by Grant Wood in 1930. He submitted as part of an art competition and he won the prize, $3,000. And over the last 90 years, people have looked at this painting, and because it's called Gothic, they've associated all kinds of negative emotions with it, all kinds of pessimism with it. They look at these people's eyes, their facial expressions, and they want to see all kinds of malicious intent. They look at his eyes. His eyes have been slightly magnified because of the big glasses that he has. They look at her face. These two don't seem to be particularly in love. I've always, every time in the classroom we talk about it, someone has to mention the pitchfork. Is he about to kill her with the pitchfork? Some kid always says. American Gothic, as the title of the painting, has absolutely nothing to do with what we consider to be Gothic, dark, demented. Gothic describes the architectural style of that window that is in the back, called Carpenter Gothic. Gothic looks like a church window. This house is in Idaho, which is where Grant Wood is from. And this house you can still go see because it's still there. These two people, the guy is Grant Wood's dentist, and the woman is Grant Wood's sister. And when asked why did he pick these two figures to be in front of this house, he said they just look like the people that would live there. Grant Wood intended this painting to be a celebration of American values because it's 1930. And the world is just entering, the United States in particular, is just entering in the Great Depression because of the stock market crash in October of 1929. This is a great example of modernism because we see what we want to see, not necessarily what the painter intended. The painter intended positivity, a reaffirmation of American values of hard work, that Midwestern ethic. These are not fancy people. These are not wealthy people, but these are good people. On the other hand, when we look at it, that's not what we see at all because of modernism. The biggest event when we talk about modernism is World War I. As you can see the statistics there, just to give you an idea of the scale of World War I, 65 million soldiers were mobilized to fight, and 9 to 11 million soldiers were killed, and more than 21 million were wounded. Now, these are big, huge estimates because World War I was a mechanized industrial war, as you'll remember from your history from last year. It was a war in which we use all the technology, all the industry, all the scientific discoveries that we had made in the 1800s and applied it to killing more people than we had ever killed before in war. By the end of that war, more than 4 million people had been taken prisoner or were missing in action, meaning people were blown apart. Just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the destruction, in the 2010 census, it was estimated that 4.8 million people lived in the state of Alabama. Okay, so twice the population of Alabama were killed just as soldiers during World War I. I like this definition of modernism better than any other I've come across, and I've taught it for so long now that I kind of forgot where I got this quote from. Modernism may be seen as an attempt to reconstruct the world in the absence of God. Modernists, there are writers, there are philosophers, there are painters. They had the feeling that society had broken down because of what had happened in World War One. The Victorian era had been a time of at least perceived order and perceived optimism. But by the time we get to World War One, that optimism and perceived order is completely gone. Another good example in art that demonstrates the way that these progressives saw the world, that's Pablo Picasso. Of course, if you know anything about art, that is Cubism, in which Picasso attempted to show an object or a person from multiple perspectives, from all angles at one time, like a broken mirror. Everything is disjointed, everything is random and unrelated. The Victorians didn't see the world this way. They saw it ordered, they saw spirituality, but the morality that held life together at the Victorian era, as far as the modernist is concerned, was entirely an illusion. These are some of the big names of modernism over there on the right. And we call this group of people the lost generation. And in particular, you'll know this name to be associated with Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, Gertrude Stein, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. And you're already familiar with Fitzgerald because you read The Great Gatsby last year, text that we're going to refer to in just a few minutes. The reason this group of people is called the Lost Generation, and Gertrude Stein is the one who is credited with saying that first and has now been used over and over and over again, that it's got a multitude of meanings. Well, first of all, this is a group of people who had lost all sense of direction, all sense of meaning because of World War I. Each one of these people had personal experiences with friends and family members, if not themselves being in the war. The lost generation also applies to all of those young people that were in fact lost. It is a loss of optimism. It is a loss of meaning. It is a loss of morality. This is the lost generation. I'd invite you to look at these photographs. And I know you have seen historical photographs of people before in war, but I want you to consider that each one of these people was somebody's brother, somebody's son, somebody's father, and they died for the change of borders in Europe. And when people began to think about people dying because of imaginary lines on a map, they began to ask questions like, how could there be a God that allows such things? How do you make sense of such devastation? What are you even supposed to do with your life if at 18 you can go to war and die and it virtually be meaningless? These are the kinds of questions that people are asking, and these are a good example of how the world becomes much more pessimistic as a response of World War I. And that pessimism is what we associate with modernism. Let's really quickly look at three big ideas that support modernism. They all happened late 1800s, early 1900s. One of the first and one of the most important is communism, the idea that people should share public facilities, that people should share land, that people are ultimately equal. Marx had this idea when he wrote the Communist Manifesto that we now take entirely for granted. But he's one of the first people to point this out, that your economics, the amount of money that you have in the bank, really determine your opportunities in life. You can think about your education right now at Hartselle High School as being very advantaged because of your background of being upper middle class, if not upper class, because of the way that your parents have made money, because of the way that your grandparents have made money. I'm willing to bet that you grew up in a household with books that someone read to you before bedtime each night. That's a product of money. That's a product of economics. Marx said, that kind of economic level that you were born into really determines the opportunities that you have in life for education, for the kinds of jobs that you'll have. Another big name, which I'm sure you have heard of, is Sigmund Freud, who is another person who says you may not be as in control of your life as you think you are. And he comes up with these ideas that, again, we take totally for granted. Now, there's a lot of stuff, of course, that he talked about that we have since learned is not entirely true, or at least is not accurate. But his understanding of the world then and of how our brains work opened up a door to think about how what we do may not actually be what we chose to do. So, some good examples of this, thinking about the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. The Oedipus complex is the idea, and the other side of it is the Electra complex for girls, Oedipus complex for boys, is that we as children imprint on our in our minds what we're looking for in a partner in the future. That girls become subconsciously sexually attracted to their fathers. And then, therefore, in the future, when they begin to look for a mate, that's the kind of person that they're going to choose. Same thing with boys. Boys have this deep seated desire, according to Freud, to kill off their father and then be with their mother. And so, yet again, maybe you're not really choosing the person that you want to be with. Maybe that is a result of your upbringing. And there's no denying that the things that happen to us when we're young children express themselves in a multitude of ways when we get to be an adult. Another big name that's a part that's associated with modernism is Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, if you know anything about Nietzsche, you know this quote of his that says, "God is dead." Well, Nietzsche didn't believe in God anyway. He was an atheist. But what he's trying to say is that there is no black and white, right and wrong. There is only what you choose to make right and wrong. He's associated with this ism, existentialism, that we exist and that is the only truth you know. And as you go along in life, you create truths for yourself. There is no, as one of my philosophy professors would say, capital T truth. There is no God. There is no purpose for your life. There is no soulmate for you. That the previous notions of God being in control and there being a moral and social order, those things are not true. We made those up. That's an underlying philosophy of modernism. So here's the big point. Even if you don't remember these names, even if you don't remember these isms, the big ideas of modernism is that you may not control things as much as you think you do. In fact, the opposite is probably true. You are probably controlled by everything going on around you, and you control very little. And taken to its fullest extent, that means that there is no truth, that everybody's just kind of making this up as they go along. Now, that can be either really comforting or it can be really scary, depending on your outlook. As we move through the last few weeks of English 262, you're going to notice some major themes that have emerged out of modernism. The biggest being violence and alienation. Alienation more than violence, but we really harp on violence after World War I. The Great Gatsby is a great example of that. That story is not told by the protagonist. That story is told from a removed point of view of the next door neighbor. And you get the sense that you never really know Gatsby. It really isn't until the very end of the story, in chapter 9, that we get the full story of Gatsby. And we know who he is and where he came from. One of the things that modernists believe is that you can't really actually know anyone. That the real person is in here. And the only way that you're going to get inside someone's head, well, there is no way to get inside someone's head, despite how well you get to know them. Another major theme that we're going to come across as we look into modernist short stories and poetry and art is the idea of historical discontinuity. The idea that cause and effect is an illusion, that human progress, the belief that we're getting better as time goes along is an illusion, and the rejection of traditional ideas and values. Now, yeah, definitely there's cause and effect. We're all reacting to things that happen to us, right? We're all responding to other people's behavior, things that happened in the past, the things that we absorb in the media. But to the extent that the effect is that human beings are getting better as we go along, that all this technology and the industrial revolution made us actually better and made us more of a community, made us closer to God. However you want to see it, that humanity got better. The modernists are very skeptical of that idea. And furthermore, they might argue the other way, that if traditional ideas of morality got us to World War I, what was the use of all of those traditional ideas and values anyway? Another major theme that we'll run across is the idea that decadence and decay go hand in hand. And again, if we look at The Great Gatsby, that is another major theme of The Great Gatsby. All of that wealth really actually made the Buchanans terrible people. The Roaring Twenties, that time of economic boom, is followed with the destruction of the economy in the 1930s because of the Depression. A fourth major theme that we're going to run into as we get into modernism is really more of a feeling than it is a message. Loss, disappointment, despair, all because of World War I, happens again at World War II, happens again at Vietnam for the Americans. Think about the end of The Great Gatsby. There was nobody happy at the end of The Great Gatsby. There was no great love story. Everyone was deluded. Everyone was wrong. Hemingway echoes this idea when he says, happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know. A fifth theme that I just want to mention, just to make you aware of it, even though we're not going to get to deal with it because in this class we're focused on British literature, is that in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, of course, you understand we have a confrontation of our history as far as race relations goes. The white hegemony, the white dominant culture begins to understand, and again, it tries to address the fact that minorities in the United States have not been treated justly. Of course, you know all about that, having grown up in the United States. As far as British literature goes, and we might have a chance to hit this at the end, we'll just see how things go. It's when you have a number of revolutions, for example, in India and in the continent of Africa, in which British colonies rebel against British authority and ultimately win their independence. And Britain has to come to terms with the fact that they have exploited what they consider to be lesser races for their own economic progress. And again, we won't get to deal with that a lot, but do be aware of it because it's a big deal in the 1900s.